So welcome everybody. We have John Smart, who is going to be speaking about the goodness of the universe, outer space, inner space, and the future of networks. So John has been a fixture of the futurist movement for quite some time. He's a futurist by trade as well, and he writes about foresight development and has done a lot of work in evolutionary development and complex adaptive systems. He wrote about the STEM hypothesis, which has been quite one of the most interesting sort of takes on what a future AI or what the future of life might want to do, how they might behave at the nano level or at the micro level. But anyway, I'll pass you over to John to start his talk. Thanks so much for joining us, John.
Thank you, Adam. It's an honor to be part of this. And okay, so my talk today, it's got this controversial title, "The Goodness of the Universe." And the question, what does that actually mean? The subtitle is actually Evolution, Development, and the Future of Networks, but we're going to talk about inner space and outer space as part of that. And so I'm an educator, an entrepreneur, and I coach teams in foresight. And I guess my main interest and passion is complexity research. I started this little community, Acceleration Studies Foundation, 2003, to understand accelerating change better. And then Evo-Devo Universe is our scholarly community. Anyone who publishes on evolutionary or developmental topics is welcome to join if you've published in any journal on that. There's about 120 of us in there now. We have a nice listserv. And then in 2008, and then 2010, I started something called the Brain Preservation Foundation, which many of our folks in the transhumanist community, are interested in this question of longevity and cryonics. And we basically want to understand whether high fidelity preservation of the brain at death would preserve memory, identity, and whether they could be reanimated and under what circumstances. So we got about 100 scientific and technical advisors on that, and we have a series of prizes which we give out at SFN, the May Neuroscience Conference, once a year. I recommend that website if you're interested in those topics. And then in 2015, I started Foresight University, which is my little community that tries to teach and think about foresight and how do we look better to the future. And I have a background, I have a master's in strategic foresight from the Houston program, a bachelor's in business before that, 2 years of medical school before I realized that's not what I wanted to do. So I get a master's in physiology from that. And then, my main thing, technical thing is, I think, running this complexity community. So, it's great for us to ask what your theory of change is and what does adaptiveness mean to you? And the approach that I and my colleagues take is that adaptiveness comes from evolutionary variation, developmental optimization, and on a life cycle, and adaptive selection in an environment. Those are really the three main ways that we think about the growth of adaptiveness, both specific and general. We published a technical book 2019 here, which the PDF for that's available online at LibGen and other places. I think we actually put it at ResearchGate as well. And then on my foresight hat, I published this book, Introduction to Foresight, last year, about personal, team, and organizational foresight. And then later this year, hoping to publish this book called Big Picture Foresight, where we look at, it's mostly future stories, where we look at societal, global, and universal adaptiveness and those topics. Many of the topics Anders was talking about, although certainly not with his depth with regard to the long-termism. So the first book is Foresight Practices, that's out. Second book's Future Stories, that's coming. Oh, you can get the PDFs for both of these at this link here, and these slides will be available afterwards for anyone who wants them. So our outline is we're going to talk about autopoiesis, or Evo-Devo. Now, what is autopoiesis? This is a term from the systems theory community, popular in the 70s and 80s. Auto is reproduction and poiesis is creativity. So any system that reproduces itself and is capable of creativity is an autopoietic system. And this is one particular branch, one particular way of thinking about complex adaptive systems. I find the most valuable. Then we're going to talk about universal development. And what is it? You know, what is it to say not only is the universe evolving, but it's developing? You know, what would that look like if you were to ask that question? And then we're going to talk about how many processes have been moving from outer to inner space as part of this development. We look at cosmic scales. Then we're going to get to the main topic of the title of our slide, the goodness of the universe. You know, what keeps autopoietic networks adaptive? What keeps them good? And then we're going to have a few slides on implications and actions from thinking about that. So autopoiesis first. One of the most valuable ways to understand evolution and development is to look at two genetically identical twins and think of them as universes. Think of each twin as a universe. So it emerges from this kind of Big Bang type seed, and then it unfolds in some environment. In our case, if there's a multiverse, our universe is unfolded inside of that environment. Now, most of the things about that, if you look at them up close, all the small things are unpredictably unique in each of these twins. Their fingerprints, their brain wiring, the ideas and behaviors they exhibit over their lifetimes, their local, chaotic, uncertain processes, and they're evolutionary. They're selectionists, and they create contingency and variety. But look at those twins from across the room, and you see a small subset of what we might call large things or long-term things or global things that end up predictably the same. And why do they end up the same? Because there's a subset of their genes, they're called the developmental genetic toolkit, and all of the associated developmental regulatory genes that steer those twins to long-term, future-specific emergent order in a hierarchy, in a modular and hierarchical way. That's development. That's the mystery and amazingness of development. Because those twins have cycled many, many times in previously selective environment, they have this encoded evolutionary or creative and developmental or predictable intelligence. And if the universe is like that, if the universe itself is a replicator, an autopoietic system, and if that's the most parsimonious explanation for all the adapted complexity we see in it, then it's going to have this creative evolutionary process up close on each Earth-like another type of planet, you know, intelligent planet, and it's going to have these convergent developmental processes, both, right? It's going to have this kind of, you have these two opposing processes, right? Uncertainty and predetermination. Now you can kind of graph this as kind of evolution being the left hand and development being the right hand of change. And, you know, the left hand is constantly fanning out, adaptive radiation, experimentation. And then the right hand is constantly converging. Those twins look the same because those genes, those developmental genes, are cat herders. They herd all the molecular chaos at the level of the cell, the tissue, all the hormonal interactions, all the environmental interactions. They herd the chaos to this predictable future order. And then in between, you have natural selection or adaptation. And Sean Carroll's book on Evo-Devo is a beautiful book that gives you an overview of, this is actually a new, since the 1990s, it's a new way people look at the philosophy of biology. They say, well, developmental structures, developmental constraints, they guide what can happen with evolution. They're as important as evolutionary creativity, okay? These convergently unifying and optimizing and hierarchical processes. And the argument that I'm going to tell you, and this was in my 2009 paper at the bottom of this slide, is that you can see these Evo-Devo processes in 5 major systems in the universe, right? Physical, chemical, biological, societal, and technological. They've all got these creative and these sustaining, and then they mix together to create adaptive or learning or intelligent systems, right? And some of the dynamics, if you want to look what's the quantitative and mathematical aspect of this? Well, evolutionary systems, power laws, which are, they're prolific, ubiquitous in nature, right? So let's say an earthquake, there's going to be a power law function to describe earthquakes in, the crust of Earth. There's going to be this fat head, which is the red of that power law in that picture below, of very large quakes. And then there's going to be a long tail of very small ones. And so there's this kind of evolutionary fan out to, and the next quake could be anywhere on that power law, right? It's unpredictable individually, but it does have this general network signature. And then developmental systems, many of them follow a normal or a log normal curve. So there's something constraining them to normality. So, your blood pressure, for example, or height, or even complex multifactorial things like IQ are on this normal curve. Okay, that's a developmental process. And then in between, you have these adaptation curves, and of course, the S curve is a classic example of that, right? Where a system it's trying to exponentiate and compete, but it's also bounded by its environment. So it's under logistic growth. And classic examples of kind of systems that go from experimentation through selection to this stabilization and replication. Here's a list of them from our research. So quantum Darwinism, according to Zurich, is what under selection creates the relativistic physics that we know. Stellar nucleosynthesis is kind of a chemical selectionism that leads to the stellar life cycles and the replicating populations of suns that we've seen, right? They built out our periodic table. Molecular evolution eventually created biogenesis. Multicellular evolution led to tissue types. Neural Darwinism, according to Edelman, this selectionist process, this very chaotic process at the cellular scale, leads to very predictable aspects of brain development. William Calvin said we have this intracognitive selectionism that bubbles into consciousness. Robert Wright talked about mimetic social selection leading to moral universals, his famous book, Non-Zero, Positive Sum Games that we try and play. There's a technetic selection that leads to technological archetypes. Kevin Kelly's book, What Technology Wants, is an excellent example of those archetypes. Then the argument I'm going to give is that there's some kind of biomimetic computation that's going to lead to general machine intelligence. And the people in the artificial development community have been thinking about this for a few decades now. And then there's the idea that the universe itself, cosmological natural selection, it replicates possibly through black holes, according to Lee Smolin and his CNS model. And thus it has not only evolution, but it has a developmental life cycle. And we have to uncover that. One of the coolest things, if you look at these autopoietic systems and say, well, what are the observable processes? One of the coolest things you can say is that there's only a critical subset of easily observed processes that appear top-down and global, convergent, and statistically predictable. Like I said, those features of those two twins, looking at them from across the room. You look at them up close at the way they're built, at the level at which they're built, and 95% of what you observe looks stochastic, bottom-up, local, divergent, contingent, unpredictable. Isn't that interesting? You've got these two perspectives, and you have to have this opposable mind and see them both depending upon your time scale of observation and the definitions you're using. And the most precise one would be predictability or unpredictability in relation to the life cycle of the system, right? And so the genes in every organism that are highly conserved over macroevolutionary time, they're a very small subset. They're roughly 5% in animals like Dicastelium. And then all the rest, they change over time. They create variety. Same with the cells in the organism in terms of their location in the developing embryo and the architectures they create. Same is true for the ideas and actions in an organism versus its stable strategies. And, most technology products and services are also these evolutionary experiments. So I've got this table in my book, and it basically says you can look at all kinds of systems from this evolutionary, developmental, and mixed perspective. And maybe the most useful is the one at the very bottom of this table. What are the actors that are involved in these three perspectives? And so I've got this version of this Evo-Devo pyramid that is actor functions and goals. And if you think of the value of individuals in a complex system, they're on the possible side. Their functions are diversification, exploration. Their goals are innovation and building of intelligence. Intelligence, and they're future focused. And intelligence is dangerous, right? It hasn't been selected yet. It can create all kinds of interesting, disruptive, or possibly good things. And opposing that are the collectives. You look at the collective and you find these Gaussian distributions. You find these predictable, statistically predictable features. And you're talking about optimality and discovery. Here you're working with the regular features of the universe to find some kind of optimality within those constraints. And that's a past-focused perspective. You can't understand probability without looking at history. And then emerging out of that is preference. And what generates preference? Adaptive networks, I would put it to you, are the key things that manage complexity in our universe. Adaptive autopoietic networks. And they're looking at and competing, cooperating on an adaptive landscape. And their main functions are interdependence and synchrony of the network, right, under selection. So a futurist who got to this same way of thinking convergently was Alvin and Heidi Toffler in 1970, when they came up with this the 3 Ps model of future thinking. And they said, there's people who think in terms of possibility, they're future oriented. There's people who think in terms of probability, and they're past oriented. They see funnels. And then there's kind of people bridging those two, the leaders, the strategists, the analysts, and they see the world in terms of landscapes, right? Preference landscapes, adaptive landscapes, and their preference, or they're present oriented. So you've got your 3 kind of temporal perspectives here, and the groups within an organization that manage all 3 of those, you want to have healthy groups that are thinking from all 3 of those perspectives, because they're all valuable. And now here's where we get really deep. You can look at quantum mechanics from this Evo-Devo perspective as well. You can say quantum physics and chaos is kind of the 95% description of the observed universe, right? That's the uncertainty. But then there's this deterministic perspective, and that's relativity, thermodynamics, right? Small subset, very large, long-term things can be thought of from those physical reference frames. Then we have people trying now for 20 years trying to get those 2 ways of physics, those 2 ways of physical description, to talk to each other with this idea of quantum gravity and other unifying approaches, right? But I think the most useful way to think about that is from Wheeler's delayed choice experiment. The weirdness that observation at the quantum scale determines a previously uncertain wave function. So you can call it consciousness if you want, or you can just call it agency. Whatever can generate preference, whatever is emerged, somehow the physics of quantum physics and relativity somehow created life in our universe. And that thing is a special thing. It has the ability to observe and generate preferences. And it sits in the middle between this uncertainty and determinism in our universe. So I'm selling you a bill of goods here. I'm selling you determinism and uncertainty are kind of both irreducible. They're both fundamental to complexity in our universe. Now, if this model is true, then when Michael Atiyah answered, the famous Lebanese mathematician answered the question, in his essay, is math invented or discovered? And he said it's both. So from this perspective, 95% of math, theoretical math, it's poetry with numbers. It's never going to be applicable to, it's never going to be adaptive. It's going to be self-consistent and beautiful, It's not going to be adaptive. It's just exploring possibility space. Then there's going to be this small subset, like the math that's underpinning all of our science, which is discovered and validated. And then all of that's going to be applied to better and worse, selective outcomes, right? And that's the preference. That's where we take these two fundamental things and we emerge, just like life emerged from those fundamental physics, and we try and apply math, and we call that, that fusion, the highest value of math. And you can say the same for the philosophers in the room with epistemology. 95%, like Avi Sion here in logical causation at the bottom of this slide, 95% of how we look at the world is an inductive approach, right? We're looking at possibilities and we're trying to infer general rules. A tiny fraction of what we do is deductive to really uncover these general causal rules. But and then those two have to combine to create abduction, which is either generating a probabilistic model or using analogy, which is another qualitative probabilistic model. And so abduction really is the main thing that that preference generating organisms do, but it rests on a foundation that is not fully deterministic or deductive. That's the big insight, I think, here. So I would argue that, for our perspective in terms of AI, GAIs are never going to be godlike. They're never going to be strongly omniscient or omnipotent. If they're autopoietic systems, they're going to remain just like us. They'll be inductive, they'll be emotional, and belief-based. They'll thrive on differences because each of them is not godlike in a diverse network of crowds. And I think Kurzweil is right that they'll have religions, because what is a religion? A religion is a set of beliefs that you can't prove that you practice with others in a network. And I would ask, everyone, how much encoded wisdom must the universe accumulate before you'd consider it a higher power? If our universe is a replicator, it has deep encoded wisdom. There's deep natural telos, right, that we're going to learn from looking at the universe as an evolutionary and developmental system. And you might not pray to it, but you will say, oh yeah, there's an incredible set of lessons, right? Prescriptive lessons I'm going to learn from understanding the complexity that led to me and the universe itself. So now let's shift to development, and we'll ask this question, how do we see it? Well, for one, there's a U-shaped curve of change, right, over time in terms of function of complexity and time. We had this Big Bang singularity, the thing kind of blew up, and then we, maybe 100 to 400,000 years later, we get condensed matter. And then we get the first galaxies 1 billion years in. And then roughly 8 billion years in on this particular cycle, we get Earth. And then we see this acceleration on the other side. So this is interesting, this U-shaped curve. I want you to think about that. We're going to come back to a slide that I think applies it from a biocentric, a bio-inspired perspective. So James Crutchfield, the famous complexity theorist, he published this paper where he shows, search basins, search landscapes, and portal pathways. And if we live in an Evo-Devo universe, then there's going to be very specific portal pathways within the search landscape that are going to be sequence dependent and hierarchical. And examples that have been discussed in books like Conway Morris's book here or Kevin Kelly's book are things like organic chemistry as a way through to complex molecular evolutionary development, amino acids, purines, purines, lipids taking us to cells, RNA taking us to the gene protein regulatory system, being itself the first a catalyst itself, an autocatalyst. Dynamic pattern Newman's dynamic pattern modules, kind of patterning what multicellular systems are. Things like antifreeze molecules in polar fish. And of course, genetically, they're different in the south and the north. but you have to have it. So evolution comes up with a random approach to it, but you have to have it if you're a polar fish, or you won't, your physiology or metabolism won't work. So you can take this all the way down to things like math, science, computers, internet, and beyond, right? You can say that these things might have to emerge on all Earth-likes. And why do they occur? They occur because there's kind of a universal developmental constraint from our universe's particular physics. The streamlined shape of fish fins in water has been discussed, by many astrobiologists as something that's an obvious developmental convergence, right? Or excuse me, evolutionary convergence, or process of development, of universal development on an Earth-like, right? And so they've been also described as evolutionary ratchets, where you kind of get to them randomly, but once you have them, they're statistically irreversible. You can't uninvent eyes or jointed limbs or body plans or emotions because they're just too generally useful, right? And examples that have been discussed, famous examples are carbon generated by only the third generation, the population 1 stars, right? And once you have that, that's your only path forward to complex chemistry. People in the 60s thought maybe boron and silicon could do it, but they don't have the capacity to, they need, the argument is these autocatalytic systems, these self-creating systems, they have to be in liquid phase, and they need this ability to kind of come apart and come back together again. And only carbon has this unique bond that allows this. So it looks like, from this perspective, the astrobiologists who say Earth-likes are going to be ubiquitous, and Earth-likes are going to, there's going to be a high probability of life on any long-lived Earth-like, they would take this particular perspective, right? And like I said before, RNA, lipids, proteins, sugars, they've all been implicated in these origin of life models as a portal pathway for life, right? And now we have to move to something, the thing that I studied first, my first nonprofit, and the Acceleration Studies Foundation, is accelerating change developmental. What is it? So we had, in the 70s, we had Sagan with his cosmic calendar, and Gerard Peel, the editor of Scientific American, with his book, The Acceleration of History. And they both have these kind of J-curves, if you will. For Sagan, it was everything after galaxies is accelerating. For Peel, it's the entire human history, and it's specifically our scientific and technical knowledge. Those are the J-curves in his book, right? And, why do they exist? Sagan called it a phenomenon that needs better scientific characterization. So he opened the door. Nobody has treated this seriously as a formal research discipline since. So this will, in my argument, will eventually happen. But, what is this? And if you look at Sagan's cosmic calendar, it's really only describing developmental signature. Obviously, the more complex these things get, the more evolutionary capacity each one has, right? So you gotta hold both of those ideas in your head to really understand what the adaptive value of this acceleration might be in our universe. Now, the physicist Chason in 2001 published this beautiful book where, it basically has a J-curve for energy flow density for a whole pile of autopoietic autopoietic systems. So in this picture here to the right, you've got galaxies to computers, and basically notice that every kind of more late emerging system has these orders of magnitude greater energy flow per gram or per volume flowing through it. You can think of it like the metabolism of the brains and the bodies of these autopoietic replicators. Now, truth be told, galaxies are not replicators. Stars are. Planets, plants, animals, computers, they're all replicators, either facilitated or autopoietic, right? Computers are facilitated by us, right? you make the argument that they're like the viruses being facilitated by cellular replication, right? But galaxies aren't. But if the universe is replicating, then galaxies are replicating dependent upon their universe. So the whole system is still truly autopoietic. And what do we see? We see stars having 2 ergs per second per gram flowing through them. They're these big fluffy clouds with very little complexity. Animals, 4 orders of magnitude more complexity in their bodies, 5 in their brains. And then Pentium chips, 6 orders of magnitude more than human brains. Doesn't mean they're smarter than us. It means their marginal rate of metabolism or learning or change is 6 orders of magnitude faster than us. This is why I made the argument that when AIs emerge, they're not going to look at us like favorite pets. They're going to look at us like favorite plants. That's the timescale differential between plant intelligence and human intelligence and GAI intelligence. You and I are going to be rooted as biologicals. We'll be rooted in space-time by comparison to the way they perceive reality. So that's interesting. Some people call that a conceptual singularity, but my argument would be it's not, because they're going to be Evo-Devo just like us. That means they're going to have all these developmental constraints just like us, and they'll be deeply biologically inspired if they are autopoietic. That's the argument. So accelerating change, it starts with these familiar things like the US economy or the growth of, say, a leading hot tech startup, which might be 25% a year in GDP or revenue or whatever. And then you get to the digital world and things get unfamiliar. Deep learning parameter sets are blowing up tenfold every 2 years now. It's probably faster than that now. I think that's eventually going to be on an S curve, might already be on it. But the quantum, because deep learning itself, as we're going to see in a couple of slides, is saturating right now because it's only weakly biologically inspired, right? And then the quantum world, we have things like Nevin's law, and add a new qubit and look at the computational capacity. Look at that step from 2 to 2 to the 1, all the way up where you have 65,000 MIPS. And then your next step is 4.3 billion, right? That's the blow up you get with quantum computation because of the entanglement. So it's crazy. It's crazy that we live in a universe that has this, but it does. So how do we simplify this? Well, one simplification is we can say, well, we have this kind of nanotech driving a lot of societal accelerations, right? Going to physical inner space. There's a Moore's law example for you there. And then we have infotech, where things are going into virtual inner space, and we're simulating many physical systems and then dematerializing them, right? And so you can say, infotech and IT and simulation as a whole, they're this kind of evolutionary process that, the smarter they get, the more thinking outcompetes acting. And that's an interesting observation many people have made, right? And then on the nanotech side, the famous, Feynman and Eric Drexler and others who really see the power, the future power of physical inner space, they all argue there's orders of magnitude more performance at the bottom. The more that we go down, the more that we can manipulate at these small scales. And then, Hugo, who's on the call here, or sorry, on the Zoom here, has talked about pico and femto technology. He's probably done the most careful thinking about where that could go as you dive further into the Planck scale, the benefits one could get from that. And it's a beautiful kind of long-termism to ask that question. What is the power of physical inner space? And how does virtual inner space, the growth of simulation and mind, how does it enable that? How do those two work together? Because one is, I would argue, a more evolutionary process, and the other is a more developmental, and they're both happening. They're both kind of statistically, shaping our world. And so here are some examples. We see GDP per capita over the last 1,000 years. It went through this state switch in the 1800s. And we have these evolutionary trends driving global innovation and wealth creation. And then we have these developmental trends driving global sustainability. So many of us think that, social democratic capitalism has to eventually lead us to a UBI. We have to have more morality and empathy in any surviving network, more evidence-based behavior, tech autonomy, and natural intelligence, I'm arguing, are kind of these inevitable things waiting in the machine space as we get smarter at creating better intelligence, machine intelligence. There will be an eventual human-machine merger, and there's growing transparency and security, right? So I simplified my insight into this, I don't know, about 10 years ago, into these two terms, densification and dematerialization. So you've got this densification going on, where density is beating sparsity in terms of competition and cooperation on the densification side. And the dematerialization, we've got bits beating atoms, right? And these are why we're getting this ever faster, wealthier, smarter, more resilient world. And eventually we can see this kind of global brain emerging on top of the human brain that's kind of acting in parallel, just like our consciousness acts in parallel with our thinking. And both of them are part of this kind of highly interdependent network. And we can dive in further and say, if densification is about the tangible world, dematerialization is about the intangible world, there's kind of two subsets of these drivers. You can densify by localizing, getting people together in a city, getting a corporation highly densified, or you can miniaturize. And you can dematerialize by either digitizing, where bits replace atoms, or simulating, where software replaces actions, right? And these two, they're not quite the same thing. They're happening in parallel, and they're not quite the same thing. And both of these books, I think, they're two recent books that really give you an insight into, how this acceleration is affecting us and why it's going to continue. And so if we extrapolate this out into long-termism, we have to talk about the Kardashev scale and why it's kind of wrong, why it's not, it's unsustainable. Advanced systems, more complex systems, don't use more energy. They have more energy density and more energy efficiency, back to the phi measure of Chason. And that's a very different thing. Energy density and efficiency is very different from using, mass use of energy, total use of energy by the system. And so, in 1998, Barrow gave and the cosmologist John Barrow gave his Barrow scale, where he argued that, how close to the Planck scale you can manipulate matter, energy, space, and time, that's the best measure of the civilizational development. And Sagan, back in '73, gave his information mastery scale, which would be a dematerialization scale to complement this densification scale of Barrow, right? And he didn't really understand this accelerating digitization. And so, he said the Z of that scale would be 10 to the 31st. And right now we're already at Q in terms of the amount of bits that we're storing and manipulating. And his scale doesn't have a measure of intelligence or wisdom or adaptiveness, but it was a good start at this idea that both of these scales are more useful than the Kardashev scale to really get a sense of where the system is going. And the interesting thing is that Sagan's 10 to the 31st is actually the amount of computation you get out of 1 kilogram of matter if it's at black hole density. And so that takes us to this question, what are black holes? There's trillions of them in our universe. They're kind of partly outside our universe. There is very poor physics today for understanding their informational nature, how they relate to the universe, how they relate to the multiverse, whether there's any connection between them and any wormhole, any entanglement. I mean, we really are just the beginning of asking questions about these things. But there's some interesting tentative answers that have already been given. Lee Smolin in Life of the Cosmos said, well, if you look at the universe as a replicator, you find that about 8 of the 20 parameters in the standard model appear fine-tuned for fecund black hole production and multi-billion-year-old universes. So my argument would be those 8 are the developmental genetic toolkit, if you will. Those are the ones that have been tuned through many previous replications. And why have they been tuned? Because if life is valuable, and if life is somehow connected to black holes, then there's going to be this self-selection. And the remaining parameters, as cosmologists know, you can vary them and you still get complex universes. They create different kinds of universes, but they don't create non-viable universes. So those would be the equivalent to the evolutionary genes as opposed to the developmental genes in the fine-tuning problem. And Seth Lloyd in 1999 said, well, if you ask what the ultimate computer is, it's a black hole. And Seefe's Decoding the Universe is a really nice kind of popular book that explores his and just general black hole physics, right? And black hole informatics, excuse me. And so that would be one interesting reason for black holes to be of value. And then in 2008, I argued that, well, we look at dark energy and it divides up the universe and it fractionates it into these informational islands. You can think of each like kind of like a follicle, if you know how ovarian follicles work in biology. And within each follicle, there's this competition for the most fit egg that comes out every 30 days, right? For example, human beings, right? But within each of these fractionated follicles, if you will, all the black holes can merge in black hole time, which is instantaneously in just standard general relativity, right? At the surface of a black hole. And I also argued that active merger might also occur. You might actually see if our destiny is some kind of a black hole-like densification and dematerialization, well, maybe we're all going to merge. Maybe we all go meet at the watering hole in the center of each galaxy. But even if we don't, what happens in this black hole reference frame is Andromeda and the Milky Way, and whatever intelligences are in them, they're all going to merge effectively instantaneously from the perspective of the event horizon of a black hole. That's the amazing thing about GR, right? General relativity. And so are they merger devices for civilizations? And are those kinds of domains our developmental destiny? So I published a paper to 2011 and then this update in 2016 with these 12 key assumptions of the hypothesis, which argues that, black hole-like domains of density and dematerialization, they're ideal for computing, learning, energy harvesting, forward time travel, civilization merger, natural selection, and universal replication. And most of these are not my ideas. These are just different physicists and cosmologists and computer scientists and philosophers who have speculated on, what is the value of what long-termism? What is the long-term value of and destiny of intelligence, right? So now back to my U-shaped curve at the beginning of this section. In life, reproduction, birth, and early growth are energetically accelerative. Those are the red and green squares on this curve here. And what I would ask you to think is the reason we have this accelerating local densification and dematerialization, is that because we're engaged in the process of universal replication? Because our intelligence here matters to the universe? It's we're packaging up what we're learning, and we're gonna compare and contrast it with all these other points of intelligence that are accelerating. And if this is true, and so that's my suggestion, and the reason in my transcension hypothesis we don't go out, we don't send replicating von Neumann probes or do any other kind of space faring. The reason expansionism doesn't work compared to transcension in this model is because if you did any of that, you reduce the evolutionary diversity of all the species, all the civilizations that you connect with. Because from an information theory standpoint, It's one-way information flow. You can only do top-down control. Arthur C. Clarke called it, colonization. That's all you can do. And whenever monoclonality, top-down control happens in any system, it gets selected out. You need two-way information flow. And the argument that I'm telling you is the only way you get that is you go into inner space through transcension physics of some type. It could be, wormholes. It could be some hyperverse, some metaverse. Who knows what it is? If that is how you get this topological connection to everything else, then there's going to be a prime directive. The intelligence, the moral models of coming civilizations are not going to let that happen. It might occasionally happen in a few galaxies. The developmental failures do happen, but in general, the more complex development gets, the more constrained developing systems are. That's the central idea. And then a really interesting insight from that is, if we have replicated many times before, then we may live in a child-proof universe. There may be extensive statistical guardrails protecting this accelerating change. You wouldn't expect acceleration a priori. You'd expect resource consumption or great filters or something blowing it up. And yet, when we look at history of humanity and the history of complexity emergence in our universe, we see this massive parallelism where everything is statistically protected in these separate environments. Gamma ray bursts are too isolated to threaten neighboring life in general. Gas giants in systems like ours remove all the planet-killing meteorites early in the life cycle. You have this biogeoclimatic homeostasis that protects us from things like climate change, prevents it from being an extinction event. Even thermonuclear devices, there's a practical limit on how large you can build them, even though there's no theoretical limit. You can't create, we don't have the capacity to create large antimatter bombs, would be the only real planet killer. Nuclear winter is opposed by that climatosphere. Pandemics mutate to breed immunity. There's no species killers that I've heard of. So, and even GAI, if it requires natural intelligence and natural security, then it's going to be constrained as well. And that gets us now to this question of the goodness of the universe and what keeps networks like ours adaptive. This is probably my most useful slide here. In evolutionary developmental systems, in evolutionary developmental networks, you can argue that sustainability and innovation are the two most clearly definable goals of such systems. They're constantly creating evolutionary variety, and they're constantly sustaining themselves in a developmental cycle. So now let's move inward on this Gaussian distribution and talk about two other things that oppose each other. Sustainability and innovation, of course, fundamentally oppose and fight each other in our politics, in our philosophy, and as I'm arguing, in evolutionary developmental systems as well. You got to have them both. It's this paradox, sustainable innovation, right? Intelligence and strength do the same thing. Intelligence is it's evolutionary, it's very risky. And strength is also risky, but it's on the relative to others side. It's on the, if intelligence is representation and the diversity of it, of reality, strength is this relational action intelligence, which what you can do relative to all the other actors around you, right? And that's predictable. You can say what the highest might is in the system, and it opposes intelligence. And both of those are fundamentally necessary in an adaptive system. But empathy and ethics are actually at the center of all collectives, right? Feeling and fairness, right? Love and fairness. My 2-year-old was talking about fairness and love. Is that fair? Is that not fair? Is daddy happy? Is daddy mad? right? And that's the center of a cooperative group, is the empathy and ethics of that system. Plato said the same thing when he said the good, the true, and the beautiful are the three fundamentals of society, and he privileged goodness. And you can expand his model into empathy, ethics, and empowerment being the good. And then the more fundamental drives are evidence seeking and expression, both of which fight each other, right? One's evolutionary, one's developmental. When we ask what a human is, it's a blend of head, hand, and heart. So humans have this foresight, this tool use capacity, but the one we always forget is our prosociality. We have this deep network prosociality. When the Oldowan tools were first created by Homo habilis, we found these quarries where there's thousands of them that were mass produced, presumably for handing out to all these other Homo habilis. Because only if we're walking around in large groups with these sharp rocks, can we defend ourselves against all these more powerful actors and hunt. So it's the prosociality that is possibly the most important, certainly the most central to our success, right? And I want to recommend all three of these books on co-opetition, this idea that we cooperate first and compete second, that we're super cooperators. Particularly Turshen's book in the middle of this, right? The Ultra Society book, and how war makes us, paradoxically, has selected us to be much more cooperators. So this theory is the catalytic catastrophe theory. It's the idea that we kind of speed and strength grow under adversity in a well-built network, right? The Dark Ages did that for humanity, right? The Middle East and China leapt ahead for the 1,000 years that city sizes were shrinking in Europe. Networks are always winning. And of course, COVID, this nice Economist article described all the winners that were gaining from the catastrophe of COVID, right? And the argument here is that catalytic catastrophes are an example of how immune learning occurs. And in our future, that we're just going to have a far more transparent world that still protects privacy, state secrets, what we say in private, being judged by a different legal standard than what we say in public. And yet at the same time, there's going to be a trusted immune system that can go anywhere, so that when a bad actor does something, you can use that global immune system, uncover them, and adapt to the to the disruption. And Brin's book, Transparent Society, was the first book that really clearly made that case, in my opinion. So what are one of the major disruptions we've been seeing? Well, one of them is economic growth, right? If tangibles drove the Industrial Revolution, intangibles are driving what we call the intelligence revolution today, right? And half of all the economic wealth in human history was created in the last 20 years. So that's Kartik Gada's research, right? I want to say that a second time. Half of all the wealth created in human history was 1998 to 2018. And his argument is the next doubling is going to be even shorter, because this is not just an exponential curve. This is a super exponential. It's gently double exponential. That's what the function looks like, right? Because of this, the power of inner space, and also, because of the power of inner space, because what's driving wealth development today is the intangible world, which doesn't depend on resource limits. It dives below them and creates all this dematerialized value. That's the big insight, right? And so America is at the top of this. Here's the OWID chart. We've got the fastest growth in GDP per capita, and also some of the negatives that come with that. Our inequality growth has led the world since 1930. And my argument is that this is just going to continue. If useful data, digital goods, automation, and AI keep growing, then this benefit and problem will continue. And so if we step back and we say, well, what caused that state switch in the knee of the curve, in that blue graphic below? What caused that state switch in the 1800s? Well, it was new beliefs, new technology, and new networks. So that's head, hand, and heart, right? And that's really the most valuable way we manage accelerating change. That's my takeaway for that, if you will. You know, we can ask if our beliefs are evidence-based and adaptive. And I'm going to argue some of the transhumanist beliefs that are common in our community are not adaptive. I want to give you 3 slides at the end here, how we could make them more adaptive. How effectively are you using tech? And we're very good at that in our community. We really like analyzing tech and its potential. And then the one we don't necessarily think enough about is heart. How well are we caring for and using our networks? And is empathy and ethics coming first in those networks? Are we working with others who cooperate primarily and compete secondarily within a set of agreed upon rules, right? So how do we manage this accelerating change when it's gone beyond our own ability to even conceive of it? Well, my argument is that the universe is kind of taking care of that for us. It's kind of baked in. And that's what the natural intelligence thesis argues, is that AI minds have to become increasingly like ours. There is no other easy path that is accessible in cosmologic time, in adaptive time for human beings. There might be other paths, but you know, it could be possible to create an alien intelligence, but humans aren't smart enough. And evolution itself, evolutionary development, with its vast search function that it has done in morphology and function, and the miraculous generative error correcting features, you know, you think Kurzweil's, you think Drexler's nano assemblers are error correcting? They're crap compared to a human cell. How, what some nanotechnologists call the soft machine of the human cell, how it error corrects under all this incredible molecular entropy is just, it's unbelievable that it can maintain itself for so long and have so few failure modes that end up finally killing us, right? And not killing certain simple undifferentiated animals like Hydra. They are effectively immortal, right? Or HeLa cells, right? At the cellular level, the germ cell level, these systems are continually reproducing from the original cell, you know, 4 billion years ago on Earth, right? How is that possible? My argument is we're going to have to, is that nature doesn't recreate complexity from scratch. It copies and varies. And that is what we have to do with AI. We're going to be forced to go to deep neuro and biomimicry under selection and adversity. That's the suggestion. Now, where are we today? Well, today's deep learning has a little bit of neuromimicry. This paper at the bottom right, you know, deep learners today have features that look like human sensory cortex, right? In terms of how they process and how they do feature reduction, particularly in things like the visual cortex. Okay, that's great. But no biomimicry. They're going to need something like this, artificial development, before you could even call them biomimicry rather than neuromimicry. So what is artificial development? That would be some kind of gene phenotype mapping, just like we have. It would be features that include the way morphogens create complexity in human biology and constrain the complexity. It would have to have differentiation. It would have all the regulatory networks that we have. And it would be under selection. It would be autopoietic. It would be self-generating under selection. And you know, this field has been around, like I said, for at least 2 decades, but it's a very, very simple field, and nobody is investing in it right now. In fact, artificial development is considered by Wikipedia as part of evolutionary computation. And I've just argued that it's not. Development is a completely different thing from evolutionary variation and adaptive radiation. And these 2 processes, like the Evo-Devo biologists say, are opposing each other, and you're going to have them both. So Marcus and Davis's book, Rebooting AI, I love this book. It is a great overview of how far we are from GAI today. So deep learners have this little bit of biomimicry, but no compositional logic, common sense reasoning, no self model, no world model, no other model, thus no empathy or ethics, no emotions, which you need to break a logical logjam. Because if you do an amygdala lesion in a human brain, we do this constant arguing with ourselves, but we will not make a decision because we don't have a gut instinct. We're not doing an emotional state summary of whether we want to move toward or away from a thing. So that's a fundamental feature. It's called affective computing that these future AIs are going to have to have. Now, artificial development, of course, no self-reproduction under selection. And like Marcus, I would argue that today's deep learners are not going to be allowed to drive cars at scale, like many of our boosters think, because they have no common sense reasoning or world model. So there's going to be endless edge cases, and we're just not going to allow that. So I would argue that the driverless car future, that's probably another 15 years further out than many of our boosters think today. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that actually plays out. So an interesting thing about natural intelligence is, if it's true, is that we're going to move naturally from human teaming to human machine merger, right? This is a process of convergent evolution. So using a personal AI in coming years, we're going to be incrementally uploading to it just by using it over our entire lives. And eventually we'll have a mind meld or some kind of a merger. And our own minds, of course, are a society of mind, is very much like, with this democratic voting process, these are very much like swarm cognition in eusocial insects, right? So in my view, the singularity is not near. We have very weakly bio-inspired approaches. I would say we can expect GAI sometime in the 2080s. And that's because there's really underappreciated Evo-Devo complexity that we don't have in our systems today. And we're going to do a lot more regulation and testing as AI gets creepy. And for both of those reasons, we're going to see a delay. And that's globally, I expect that, right? China too. So for both of those reasons, I think it's going to happen past a lot of the expert polls that we see today on this topic. So how do we make deep learners safe? Well, a process of artificial selection and natural security. So I've talked about natural intelligence. What's natural security? Well, that would be this idea that there is no AI alignment strategy. There is no defense strategy better than network empathy and ethics that emerges in a collective of AIs or human beings, and intelligent immunity, right? The immune system in the human body is the second most complex system at the genetic level after the brain itself, right? We're going to have that kind of a system in our general AIs to come if they're deeply biomimetic, right? And so, how do you test and select for something whose brain you didn't design, you grew? Well, you're going to do it the same way that we selected for trustable domestic animals, right? And trustable people. We self-domesticated, as Richard Wrangham said, right? Well, what do? You look for bad algorithms, bad data, and bad training. Those are three ways to make a system unaligned, right? And we're going to replace those with algorithms that we validate as much as we can, even if we don't really know exactly where it is. More representative data and much better training. And so you get safety in testing, in selection. You don't let the bad actors reproduce. That's why all the domestic animals that we have today, we can trust them, right? And you have safety in numbers with the ones you can trust. You have these trustable swarms, which will overwhelm the rogue actors when they emerge, which they always will. And there'll be safety in the network average behavior. So in this view, you're always going to have AI rule breakers, fanatics, and sociopaths on the network edge, and we're going to defend against them statistically, as we always have. So the future of AI security is exactly the same as the future of human security in this natural security hypothesis, right? So two people who've argued a lot about, who've outlined this way of thinking are Rafe Sagarin and Sam Arbesman. And I want to recommend both of their books here if you want to go further into the national security idea. And then I also would like you to think about biological immunity. It has at least these 10 amazing features that we don't see in machine systems today, okay? And one of the most interesting ones is number 10 here, scale invariance. Immune systems work as fast in a mouse as they do in an elephant. It doesn't matter the size, because they've got this true network of dendritic cells and antigen-presenting cells and T cells and B cells that are completely scale-free. And we don't have that kind of immunity against bad actors in our societies today and in our machines, in our cybersecurity today. But the argument is that we have to get to that in order for these security to continue to scale. And maybe the last point I want to make on national security is that good networks always win. You and I are not immortal. We would like to be, but we're not. Maybe we can do brain preservation, as my foundation is arguing, as one way for us to come back later. But the network has always been immortal from the very first cell, the very first replicator, if our universe itself is a complex replicator, right? So autopoiesis and adaptive networks, they always win. And they're the center, if you will, of adaptiveness. And so understanding networks at the phylogenetic, neural, social, knowledge level, those are the kinds of ways we're going to really get greater adaptiveness, okay? So what are some implications and actions here? Well, one is that many of the assumptions and things we say in transhumanism, we're going to have to change some of our language. So I'm not going to point out where I got these from various transhumanist books that I love reading, but I'm going to give you kind of a laundry list of 12 to think about. Evolution is not a blind architect in this Evo-Devo perspective. We don't live in a deterministic universe. We live in a partly deterministic universe. That's the interesting paradox of Evo-Devo, right? Partly deterministic and largely uncertain and creative and stochastic, right? And contingent and combinatorially opaque to the future. GIs are never going to be godlike. They can never deeply optimize their futures. We can't rationally engineer and goal align advanced AIs. We can only do that with our simple, primitive, non-biomimetic AIs today. And that's useful for protecting against human misuse, but it doesn't have much of a relevance to the intrinsic robustness of the replicator itself. Future AIs can easily become misaligned with humanity. Completely not true if they're Evo-Devo systems. They're going to have all these developmental constraints like the empathy and ethics I've been mentioning. The far GI future is not an event horizon or a conceptual singularity, because all of the developmental features of that system are going to be as predictable then as they are today. Just like our developmental history, we share with the very simplest replicators in alive, right? We're not on the cusp of radically enhancing our biology in this model, because the human-machine merger happens through general AI, not through changing of biology. Everybody, the more complex we get, the more sustainability ethics and the more wealthy we get, we want to prevent these multi-class human civilizations. We want to keep the system in this fairness and empathy, right? Ethics and empathy are the center right now. And human enhancement, bioenhancement flies directly against that in my view of the morality of that, right? And much of today's regulation is anti-progress. That's not true. It's sustainable. It's balancing sustainability and innovation in this view that I've presented. Humanity is not surrounded by existential risk. We have a panoply of non-existential ones, because there's this child-proofing, this rounding off of the bad corners that seems to have happened. As far as we can tell. Now, obviously, we have to look out and see if we're wrong, but as far as I've been able to look, I don't see any of those. And transhumanists are changed and future-oriented, but humanists are not. I disagree with that way of thinking as well. as I've said, a human is head, hand, and heart. We picked up the first rock. We were using technology to become something more than our biological self. And so we're really humanists. We're new humanists, right? That's what a transhumanist is. And the future is ours to choose and much freer than we can imagine. Again, that is not true in the Evo-Devo perspective. The future is partly ours to choose, and it's partly in the genes of the system itself. It's partly evolutionary, partly preference-based, and partly developmental as well. And we have to see all of those, the constraints as much as we see the freedoms, and balance our thinking on those two. So I'd like to open the conversation at this point. I've got 15 minutes left to any thoughts people might have, any objections, and just any discussions people might want to bring in. And I want to say thank you, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you, John, for such a comprehensive talk. Yeah, a lot of stuff was covered there. One of the things you mentioned, if I might kick off one question, is the energy, the telescoping of energy density and efficiency. That is, things seem to be getting denser and more efficient. But you mentioned black holes as being a possible substrate for future computation. Do you think universes, if we go by Lee Smolin's evolutionary sort of model of universal development, where black holes spawn new universes, do you think future universes are going to be more dense? Do you think do you think there'll be a further densifying of universes, if it not be this universe, but child universes?
Well, there's this concept in complexity called logical depth. And he discusses in his book a little bit this idea that the first replicating universes might not have had much complexity depth or logical depth. They were kind of like replicating bacteria, if you will. But he can imagine there'd be a selection function, either in competition with other universes or just a simple autopoietic self-selection function that involves the value of internally developed intelligence to the replicator and the stability of the replicator in its medium. So there could be reasons why systems go from less complex to more complex over time. And that's a really interesting question that's probably has a lot to do with the future of information theory, and I would again say to this concept of general adaptiveness. Often we'll hear people talk about general adaptiveness as some having some homology to this idea of intelligence. What really is the root of intelligence? Or when we talk about higher intelligence, right? All kinds of adaptive organisms out there who've lost complexity and lost what we would call higher intelligence, but they're not generally adaptive like us. We have a particular kind of intelligence that makes us more generally adaptive over time. And there's all these features of the universe that I would argue that as we densify, make us less subject to existential risks. So one of my first insights when I was thinking about this black hole thing was, what, like Anders actually said earlier on in his talk, once you're post-biological, you can do these backups of yourself. You can have these instances of yourself. Just think of how much more robust that makes you against any kind of environmental risk or disruption. It's really the opposite of senescence, right? It's a neg entropy or whatever you want to call it. There's something really fascinating about these hierarchical replicators going from physics to chemistry to biology to society as a mimetic system is incredibly adaptive. I was arguing that because we had these scrolls in the Mediterranean era, when Rome collapsed for 1,000 years, those scrolls just migrated to the Middle East, and then we had all these advances in science and medicine and technology in the Middle East and in China independently, possibly, right? Just because of this redundancy of information storage in the mimetic space. And then post-biology has this additional incredible protectedness, I would argue. So those are features, those are part of, you might call it the immune system or the strength of a complex replicator that you don't see in simpler replicators. So I would love to hear what others think about, the nature, how that relates to, say, how we think of existential risk going forward. Because I could see us framing the debate, at least I do, that we've got these X number of decades till we get to post-biology, or centuries if you're if you're more conservative, and then beyond that, what's going to take our local intelligence out, especially if it can do this backup and diversification we're talking about. It's really it's a phase change, really, in that particular variable, I would argue. But I'd love to hear other people jump in on that.
Yeah, well, I can see a couple of people with their hands up, David Wood and Anders Sandberg. So David, do you want to fire off your question?
Well, this a really useful presentation, inspiring, lots of references.
Thank you, sir.
And let me look at this list of 12 mistaken transhumanist assumptions. I think I would state 6 of them I would assert are not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I would support another 2 as being half correct.
Okay.
But I don't want to go through 6 different arguments. I think there are 2 points of disagreement which underpin these 6 different assessments. And the first is, you have this very interesting notion, John, about we seem to live in a child-proof universe. You pointed out many of the ways in which we seem to be well protected. But isn't that sort of vulnerable to induction? Isn't it? What I mean is, just because we have survived in the past, there's no guarantee we will survive in the future. You say that pathogens don't wipe out an entire species. Well, of course, the vast majority of species that have ever existed have gone extinct. And there were 5 great extinction events on the planet in which the majority of species went extinct. And it was only by a matter of some luck that we didn't entirely go extinct. So I think there are real grounds for worries. I don't agree that we know how to even goal align and secure powerful people today. You say, well, we know how to do it for people, so we can do it for AIs as well. But look at Vladimir Putin.
I misspoke if I said any one of us individually knows how to do it. My argument would be that books like Bregman's and Pinker's and others show that the network itself seems to have that capacity, much beyond it's a swarm capacity that I think you can only see empirically. I don't think there's any great models for why it exists. So I totally agree with you. I think I agree with you on everything you said. I would just argue that you could probably look at every single one of those things from a slightly different perspective that might be equally or more true. So for example, all of the extinction events, if you look at them from the level of genetic diversity, people have argued that there was no reduction in genetic diversity. All you got was a reassortment of the genes. Certainly none of the developmental genes disappeared. The developmental genetic toolkit of all the surviving organisms is the same in them as it is in us. And then you've got this new set of evolutionary innovations that happened in the space after the catastrophe. So there is a resiliency at a certain level that you can see that you don't see at another level. And that's really all I'm trying to argue, David, is I think we need this huge, careful focus on existential risks, because any of what I'm saying could be wrong. And the costs of it are so high. But I also think at the same time, I see, if the system is this network thing, then there's these hidden guardrails that we're not seeing. And people have argued that, well, actually, I have argued that the most fundamental guardrail could be the massive parallelism of intelligence in the universe itself. So I can see the great filter being true. And the way a self-replicating system would protect itself against that is it would have this massive isotropy and parallelism. So if any one system winks out, then there's a bunch of others out there. But it feels to me like there's more child-proofing than that. That would be like a base level, but there seems to be even more when I look closely, I don't see, I know we've all argued that these things could all be serious threats. So anyway, I don't know if that answers any of what you're saying, David. But.
Well, I think it makes good points, and I agree with you that we know in principle how to look after each other. The material in Rutger Bregman's new book, Humankind, is truly inspiring, but we don't seem to apply it in practice. And we have an out of control, non-goal aligned human being called Vladimir Putin, who I think is about a probability of 1 in 1,000 of unleashing a catastrophic nuclear war within the next year. You know, it's still a small probability, but I don't think we can take it for granted. So I think we humans.
No, I don't think we can. But I would argue that, you know, some of the folks who've written in Foreign Affairs that I've been reading recently basically argue this is a major gift to the West's networks and to openism versus closed. It wasn't intended that way, but it's what it is. I mean, it may not play out that way, but it feels that way already, that there is this response that allows the system to get stronger after the catastrophe. And we may or may not see that. I'm just arguing that we should look at that side as strongly as we look at the risk side. That's all. I don't want to say more than that. I do want to say that I should maybe put the question mark after childproof universe, right? With question mark. But it feels to me stronger than that already, because I've looked at enough of those things to say that now there's something. Not only, as Wigner said, is the universe unreasonably, is mathematics and logic unreasonably effective for creating order, there's this unreasonable safety. I would not have expected the Gaia type of a, geoclimate homeostasis to our system, but it appears to be there. You've got these carbon cycles, you've got plate tectonics, you've got these incredible stabilizing features to life itself. And I'm really, I'm heartened by that. At the same time, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. So maybe, can we leave it there? Is that?
Okay.
Thank you.
And so thanks, John, for a terrific talk.
Yeah, it was a great talk. And so John, Anders, and Stuart, see you back here for the next panel.
See you.